Imagine coming home one morning expecting to find your family safe in bed, only to discover a nightmare that would haunt an entire town for decades. Four people brutally murdered in a small cabin with no clear answers. Welcome to the chilling and unsolved mystery of the Keddie Cabin Murders, where the more you dig, the darker it gets. In the spring of 1981, Cabin 28 in the quiet town of Keddie, California, became the setting for one of the most gruesome crimes in the state's history. A mother, her son, his friend, and a missing daughter, later found dead, all became victims of an unimaginable horror. But what makes this crime even more chilling? 40 years later, no one has ever been charged. Despite new evidence and leads, this case remains unsolved, leaving a trail of confusion, fear, and questions that continue to haunt the families and the community. How could a crime so brutal go unpunished for so long? This is the mystery we're diving into today. Keddie, California, was the kind of place where people went to escape. Tucked away in the Sierra Nevada mountains, this small, quiet community offered peace and isolation far from the rush of city life. It was the perfect place to start over, a refuge for those looking to rebuild their lives. But in this very isolation, darkness can sometimes hide. Cabin 28, where the Sharp family lived, sat in this remote, seemingly idyllic setting. The cabin itself was modest, nestled among the tall pines, part of a rundown resort that had seen better days. The surrounding forest provided a sense of calm and safety, but it also created a wall of silence and secrecy. Neighbors were close, but not close enough to hear the terror that would unfold. The peaceful atmosphere in Keddie was deceptive. While the town appeared tranquil, its remoteness meant that if something went wrong, help would be far away. It was a place where voices could go unheard, and in April of 1981, that eerie silence would be broken in the most violent way. Glenna Sue Sharp was a mother trying to rebuild her life. After a difficult divorce, she packed up her five children and moved from Connecticut to the small, secluded town of Keddie, California, hoping for a fresh start. Keddie offered Sue what she needed, a quiet place to raise her kids on her own terms. Life wasn't easy, but Sue was determined to make it work. She rented Cabin 28 and settled in with her children John, Sheila, Tina, Greg, and Rick, hoping this mountain community would be a safe haven. Sue was known for being a strong, independent woman. Despite the financial struggles that came with being a single mother, she did her best to provide for her children, working odd jobs and relying on welfare when necessary. Her family was close knit, and Sue was the anchor. Yet, like any family, they had their challenges. John, Sue's 15-year-old son, was a typical teenager full of energy and sometimes a bit rebellious. On the night of the murders, he had a friend staying over, Dana Wingate, a 17-year-old who was known as a kind, easygoing kid. What brought them all to Keddie was Sue's desire to start over, to leave the past behind, and create a stable environment for her children. But in this search for peace, they unknowingly walked into a storm. What seemed like a safe, isolated community would soon become the backdrop for an unimaginable horror, forever changing the lives of those who knew them. It was a morning that would forever haunt Sheila Sharp. On April 12, 1981, Sheila, Sue's oldest daughter, returned home from a sleepover at a neighbor's house. What she walked into was nothing short of a nightmare. As she approached Cabin 28, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. But the moment she stepped inside, the horror unfolded before her eyes. The living room was a scene of unimaginable brutality. Her mother, Sue, lay lifeless on the floor, bound with electrical wire, her body beaten and stabbed repeatedly. Nearby, her brother John and his friend Dana Wingate were equally gruesome sights. Both had been beaten with a hammer and strangled. Blood covered the walls and furniture, a terrifying testament to the violence that had taken place in the small cabin. But the shock didn't end there. As Sheila processed the scene in front of her, it became clear that her younger sister Tina, 12 years old, was missing. Tina's bed was empty, and there were no signs of her anywhere in the house. What had started as a night of fun for Sheila quickly turned into the darkest day of her life. The discovery shook the small town of Keddie to its core. It was a close knit community where families looked out for each other, but this crime shattered any sense of safety. Word spread quickly, and soon the once quiet streets were filled with whispers and fear. The unthinkable had happened in their own backyard, and no one could understand how such violence could erupt in their peaceful town. The crime scene inside Cabin 28 was a picture of sheer violence, a chaotic display of brutality that left investigators stunned. What made this scene especially unsettling was not just the savagery of the murders, but the strange, almost calculated nature of the aftermath. Multiple weapons had been used to carry out the killings: a hammer, a knife, and a bent steak knife that lay broken near Sue's body, suggesting the sheer force behind the attack. Sue Sharp had been gagged with her own underwear secured by medical tape. Her wrists and ankles were bound with electrical cords, further hinting at the sadistic nature of the killers. The blood splatter told a grim story, a struggle, a desperate fight for life, but the violence was overwhelming. Both John Sharp and Dana Wingate were found near Sue, bound and bludgeoned. John had suffered extensive head injuries, likely from a hammer, and Dana had been strangled in addition to the blows he sustained. Blood was smeared on the walls, the floor, and the furniture, as if the attackers had no regard for the chaos they created. One eerie detail that stood out was how certain aspects of the crime scene appeared staged. Chairs were knocked over and items were scattered around the room, almost as if to confuse investigators or give the impression of a robbery gone wrong. Yet nothing significant seemed to be missing, and there was no sign of forced entry into the cabin, raising immediate questions about how the killers gained access. Could they have been known to the family? Were they invited in, or did they somehow slip through undetected? These early questions added to the chilling mystery that surrounded the case. The scene was both chaotic and eerily controlled, leaving more questions than answers in its wake. The mixture of duct tape, multiple weapons, and a lack of forced entry made it clear that this was not a random act of violence, but something far more deliberate. But why, and who could carry out such a calculated massacre in a town where everyone knew each other? While the bodies of Sue, John, and Dana lay lifeless in cabin 28, the absence of 12-year-old Tina Sharp deepened the horror. Tina's bed was untouched, and there were no immediate signs of struggle in her room. The fear quickly shifted from the murders to her mysterious disappearance. Could Tina have escaped the brutal attack, or worse, had she been taken by the killers? The authorities quickly launched a search, fearing the worst. Search parties were organized, combing through the dense woods surrounding Keddie, hoping to find any sign of the missing girl. Helicopters scoured the remote mountain areas, and local volunteers joined law enforcement to search for any clue. But there was nothing: no footprints, no signs of a struggle outside the cabin, and no eyewitnesses who saw her leave. It was as if Tina had simply vanished into thin air. The uncertainty surrounding her fate added a chilling layer to an already gruesome crime. Was she still alive, held captive somewhere? The possibility that she had witnessed the murders only increased the urgency of the search, but as days turned into weeks, the lack of any leads deepened the confusion and fear in the community. Weeks passed, then months, and still there was no sign of Tina. The authorities continued to follow every possible lead, but each turned into a dead end. For Tina's family and the people of Keddie, the waiting was agonizing. With no body and no answers, all they could do was hope that somehow she had survived the unimaginable, even as doubt crept in with each passing day. For 3 long years, the question of Tina's whereabouts would hang over the investigation like a shadow, leaving an empty seat at the Sharp family's table and an unsolved mystery in the heart of Keddie. It would take years before her tragic fate was finally uncovered. In the hours following the discovery of the murders, law enforcement descended on Cabin 28, determined to find answers to this horrific crime. The first priority was securing the crime scene, but even in these early moments, cracks began to show in the investigation. The chaotic nature of the crime scene, combined with the small town police force's inexperience in handling such a gruesome and complex case, would later lead to significant criticism. As officers moved through the cabin, their attempts to gather evidence were far from perfect. Multiple people walked through the crime scene, unintentionally contaminating potential clues. Fingerprints were smudged, blood evidence was not properly documented, and critical details were overlooked. Even some of the tools used in the murders, like the bloody hammer and knife, were initially missed in the first sweep of the cabin. The disorder of the crime scene, combined with the lack of a clear protocol, made it difficult to piece together the timeline of events with precision. One of the immediate challenges was the lack of forced entry. This raised questions about whether the victims knew their attackers or whether the killers were able to enter the cabin unnoticed. The possibility of someone inside letting the perpetrators in became a key focus early on, but with so little evidence properly secured, investigators were left guessing. Despite these missteps, law enforcement quickly zeroed in on a few initial suspects. Marty Smart, a neighbor with a known temper, was one of the first to raise suspicion. His close relationship with the Sharp family, particularly his turbulent marriage to Marilyn Smart, who was friendly with Sue, made him a person of interest. Additionally, his friend, Bo Baubed, who had been staying with him at the time, also fell under scrutiny due to his criminal background. Although Marty and Bo were questioned, their alibis and connections to the crime seemed shaky, but without strong physical evidence, investigators struggled to build a concrete case. The lack of coordination and the mishandling of early clues only compounded the frustration. With each passing day, the once hopeful investigation lost momentum, and as the suspects slipped away, the possibility of justice for the Sharp family began to fade. These early missteps in the investigation would haunt the case for decades, leaving critical questions unanswered and casting doubt on whether the truth would ever fully come to light. Marty Smart quickly became a key figure in the investigation, not just because he was a neighbor of the Sharp family, but because of the complicated and strained relationship he had with Sue Sharp. Marty was married to Marilyn Smart, who was not only a close neighbor, but also a friend of Sue's. The Smart family lived nearby in the same Keddie resort, and the interactions between these households raised immediate suspicion. Marty was known for his volatile temper and his turbulent marriage to Marilyn. Their relationship had been on the rocks for some time, marked by frequent arguments and Marty's aggressive tendencies. Sue, as a single mother herself, had reportedly become a confidante to Marilyn, often offering advice and support. Some speculated that Sue had been encouraging Marilyn to leave Marty, seeing how unhealthy and potentially dangerous the marriage had become. This alleged interference didn't sit well with Marty. In the small, isolated community of Keddie, rumors began to swirl about the growing tension between Marty and Sue. Was Marty angry at Sue for meddling in his marriage? Did he see her as a threat to his control over Marilyn? The fact that Sue's life had intersected with Marty's troubled personal affairs offered a possible motive for violence. There were also whispers of other potential motives. Some believed that Marty, already frustrated and unstable, might have lashed out in a fit of jealousy or rage, especially if he felt that Sue's influence was driving his wife away. While nothing concrete linked Marty directly to the crime at this point, the relationship between him, Marilyn, and Sue painted a picture of a man with deep personal grievances, a man who may have had reasons, dark and desperate enough, to target Sue Sharp and her family. As investigators looked closer, Marty Smart's name would continue to resurface, but the tangled web of relationships and emotions made it difficult to determine whether his involvement was rooted in personal vendetta or something more sinister. As the investigation into the Keddie murders continued, a shocking revelation surfaced. Marty Smart allegedly confessed to the killings during a session with his counselor. According to reports, Marty, overwhelmed with guilt and frustration, admitted to his involvement in the murders. However, despite the weight of such a confession, law enforcement failed to act decisively on this information. This raised immediate concerns about the effectiveness of the investigation and why such a critical lead was not followed up thoroughly. Marty's confession didn't seem to prompt the immediate, intense scrutiny one might expect in a case this severe. Instead, it became another piece of information that floated around without proper follow up. Even though a counselor came forward to relay this information, claiming that Marty admitted to the crime, law enforcement's response was lukewarm at best. There were questions about the credibility of the confession, particularly since it hadn't been made directly to the police, but the fact that this lead wasn't aggressively pursued has been a point of criticism ever since. Additionally, Marty agreed to take a polygraph test, which should have added some clarity to the situation. However, the results were inconclusive. Some reports suggest that he passed the test, while others cast doubt on the validity of the polygraph altogether. Given the unreliable nature of polygraphs and their inability to be used as solid evidence in court, the doubts surrounding Marty's involvement persisted. The tests neither fully exonerated him nor pinned him down as the killer. What made Marty's confession so perplexing was the lack of urgency from the investigators to dig deeper into his potential role. Was this a genuine admission of guilt, or was it the rambling of a man caught in the emotional whirlwind of his failing life? The decision not to investigate Marty further after such a bombshell confession and to seemingly overlook the polygraph results left a cloud of suspicion hanging over the investigation. It raised serious questions about whether critical opportunities to solve the case were lost in those early stages. For many, the failure to pursue Marty Smart more aggressively remains one of the great frustrations of the Keddie case. Could this confession have been the key to solving the mystery if only it had been taken more seriously? Or was Marty's involvement never as clear-cut as some believed? The uncertainty still lingers, and with it, doubts about whether justice was truly sought in those crucial early days. From the very beginning, the Keddie murders were surrounded by a whirlwind of theories, each more unsettling than the last. As investigators struggled to piece together the puzzle, the lack of clear answers fueled rampant speculation. Was this a crime of passion, driven by personal grudges? Or was there something more sinister beneath the surface? The violence was extreme, personal, almost frenzied, a hallmark of emotional rage, rather than a calculated, detached act. Sue Sharp, as a single mother, seemed to be the central figure in this tragedy. But why? And how deep did her connections in this small town go? One of the earliest theories pointed toward a crime of passion. Sue, by many accounts, was a strong-willed woman who had found herself at odds with certain individuals in Keddie. The most obvious candidate was Marty Smart. With Sue possibly encouraging his wife Marilyn to leave him, Marty could have seen Sue as a direct threat to his already crumbling life. The emotional weight of a failing marriage, compounded by the sense that Sue was driving a wedge between him and his wife, could easily have triggered a violent, irrational response. This theory fits well with the extreme nature of the murders where Sue bore the brunt of the violence. But passion alone doesn't fully explain the scope of the crime. Why involve the children? Why Dana Wingate? Was this simply Marty's way of eliminating any witnesses, or did something else motivate the killings? Some speculated that Sue Sharp may have had enemies beyond Marty. Perhaps she had unknowingly crossed the wrong person in this quiet, secluded town. Was she involved in something darker, something hidden beneath the surface of Keddie's outwardly peaceful facade? It's not impossible to imagine a small town harboring secrets, and Sue's independent nature could have led her to cross paths with someone capable of such brutality. One of the more mysterious elements in the investigation came in the form of an anonymous phone call to the sheriff's department. The call suggested a connection between Marty Smart and the killings, a hint that Marty and his friend Bo Baubed were involved in some way. Yet, despite this cryptic tip, no immediate action was taken. The phone call added fuel to the fire of speculation. Who made the call? Why didn't the authorities chase this lead with more vigor? Was this a legitimate tip or just another dead end in a sea of confusion? This anonymous call, combined with Marty's troubled relationship with Sue, created a narrative that seemed to point squarely at him. But the investigation's failures to properly handle these leads led to widespread frustration. Even today, many believe that if the police had taken the phone call and Marty's confession more seriously, the case might have been solved decades ago. Now, here's where I lean into my own thoughts. The fact that Marty Smart was never fully pursued remains one of the most baffling aspects of this case. He had a clear motive, personal, emotional, and deeply tied to his domestic life. His confession, the anonymous tip, and his volatile nature all make him the most logical suspect. Yet, time and time again, these leads were either mishandled or outright ignored. Was it incompetence, or was there something darker at play in the Keddie investigation? I can't help but wonder if there were forces, small town politics, personal relationships within the community that may have protected Marty from further scrutiny. It's not unheard of, especially in cases like these, where local connections can cloud judgment and allow key suspects to slip through the cracks. Theories of passion, revenge, and secrets hidden in the shadows of Keddie will continue to haunt this case. The deeper you dig, the more unsettling the unanswered questions become. Was Marty truly the mastermind behind these brutal killings, or was he a convenient scapegoat in a town that desperately wanted to move on from its darkest night? The truth, as elusive as it is, lies buried somewhere between fact, rumor, and silence. In the end, what we're left with is the unsettling feeling that this case was never just about one night of violence. It's about the secrets that people carry, the ones that small towns bury, and the mistakes that can prevent justice from being served. And the more we speculate, the more we realize just how little we know about what really happened that night in Cabin 28. In April of 1984, 3 years after the horrific murders in Keddie, a discovery was made that both deepened the mystery and shattered any remaining hope for the Sharp family. In a desolate area of Feather Falls, roughly 50 miles from the Sharp family's cabin, skeletal remains were found. These remains, after analysis, were confirmed to belong to 12-year-old Tina Sharp, the missing daughter who had vanished on the night of the murders. The discovery of her bones brought with it more questions than answers and complicated an already tangled investigation. The fact that Tina's remains were found so far away raised immediate concerns about the extent of the crime and the motives behind it. Why was she taken from the cabin while the others were killed on the spot? What happened in those final hours of her life? The condition of her remains gave little information about the cause of death, leaving investigators to speculate whether Tina had been killed that night or if she had been held somewhere before her death. The distance from Keddie to Feather Falls suggested a level of planning that didn't fit neatly with the idea of a crime of passion. Could this have been part of a larger, more organized plot? The discovery hinted at a killer or killers who had gone to great lengths to hide their involvement. For the Sharp family, this discovery was devastating. Any lingering hope that Tina might somehow still be alive was cruelly extinguished. Sheila Sharp, already haunted by the trauma of finding her mother, brother, and friend murdered, now had to confront the painful reality that her sister too was gone. The community of Keddie, which had been trying to heal from the original murders, was once again plunged into fear and confusion. The discovery of Tina's remains only intensified the sense that this crime was far more complex than anyone had realized. The implications for the investigation were immediate and significant. The location of the remains suggested that the killers had not only committed a brutal and personal crime, but had also gone to great lengths to cover their tracks. Investigators were forced to reconsider their previous assumptions. If Tina had been taken so far from the crime scene, it implied that the perpetrators had more resources and control than originally thought. They weren't just reacting in a moment of rage, they had a plan, and Tina was somehow central to it. Yet, as much as Tina's remains provided a vital clue, they also added to the frustration surrounding the case. The passage of time had eroded much of the physical evidence, and the skeletal nature of the remains meant there was little forensic material left to analyze. The discovery, while significant, led to a dead end in many respects. It further emphasized how much had been lost in the early days of the investigation when critical leads and potential evidence had been mishandled or ignored. For the Sharp family and the town of Keddie, the discovery of Tina's remains was a painful reminder of the depth of the tragedy that had struck their quiet community. It reignited the fear that had been simmering under the surface for 3 years, fear that a killer was still out there, and that justice, despite this new development, remained just as elusive as it had always been. Tina's death, like the others, would remain part of a cruel mystery that seemed no closer to being solved, even with this heartbreaking revelation. The Keddie Cabin murders are not just a haunting mystery, they are also a glaring example of how investigative missteps can cripple a case and leave justice unserved. From the very beginning, the handling of this case by law enforcement was marked by critical failures that would haunt the investigation for years to come. Each misstep contributed to the slow unraveling of any hope for resolution, leaving the victims' families and the community grasping for answers. One of the most damaging issues was the initial mishandling of the crime scene. Cabin 28 should have been locked down and meticulously analyzed for every clue. Instead, multiple people, including law enforcement officers and curious onlookers, moved in and out of the scene, contaminating vital evidence. Fingerprints were smudged, blood splatter patterns were disturbed, and the entire scene was altered in ways that made it nearly impossible to reconstruct the events of that night with precision. This early lack of control over the crime scene set the investigation back right from the start. In addition to the chaotic crime scene management, several key pieces of evidence were either overlooked or improperly handled. The murder weapons, for example, were not immediately found despite being in plain sight. The bloody hammer and knife, critical to piecing together the timeline of the murders, were only discovered after a second sweep of the cabin. These kinds of oversights cast serious doubts on the thoroughness of the investigation and allowed important clues to slip through the cracks. Beyond the physical evidence, law enforcement also failed to follow up on several promising leads. Marty Smart's alleged confession during a counseling session, a lead that could have unraveled the case early on, was not pursued with the seriousness it deserved. His polygraph test results were inconclusive, but instead of digging deeper, investigators seemed to lose momentum, allowing one of their primary suspects to fade into the background. The mysterious phone call implicating Marty and his friend Bo Baubed was another opportunity squandered despite the potential significance of this anonymous tip. It was never thoroughly investigated. Then there were the missed connections between the various suspects and the victims. Investigators failed to probe deeply into the tangled relationships between Sue Sharp, Marty, and Marilyn Smart. The fact that Sue may have been advising Marilyn to leave Marty should have raised red flags about a possible motive, but instead it was treated as a minor detail. In small communities like Keddie, personal relationships often hold the key to understanding crimes, but in this case, law enforcement appeared blind to these dynamics. Another area where law enforcement dropped the ball was in the search for Tina Sharp. When she disappeared, the urgency to find her should have been paramount. However, despite extensive searches, it felt as though Tina's disappearance was not treated with the same focus as the murders themselves. When her remains were discovered 3 years later, 50 miles away, it became painfully clear how much time and opportunity had been lost in those critical early days. These missteps weren't just small errors, they were monumental failures that helped push the case further into obscurity. The passage of time, combined with the mishandling of crucial evidence and leads, created a perfect storm of lost opportunities. The Keddie case became one of those tragic examples where it seemed like law enforcement was constantly playing catch up, always one step behind, unable to bring the pieces together. It's impossible to know whether the case could have been solved had these early mistakes been avoided. But what's clear is that the mismanagement by law enforcement played a significant role in the case going cold. The mistakes made in the Keddie Cabin Murders investigation serve as a harsh reminder of how fragile justice can be when those tasked with delivering it fall short. The victims, their families, and the community deserved better than the confusion and inaction that marked this investigation, and the scars of those failures remain even today. Decades after the Keddie murders, advancements in forensic technology brought a glimmer of hope to a case that had long grown cold. The introduction of new DNA testing techniques provided a fresh angle, one that investigators in the early 80s could only have dreamed of. In the years since the murders, technology had progressed to the point where even the smallest traces of genetic material, once thought unusable, could now offer new insights. These advancements reignited interest in the Keddie case, sparking hope that justice might finally be served. Forensic experts began re examining the evidence, focusing on key items recovered from the crime scene, including the blood stained tape, clothing, and tools used in the brutal killings. With DNA profiling, investigators were able to analyze biological material that had been overlooked or considered unusable decades before. The hope was that this new testing would identify a suspect or, at the very least, rule out individuals who had long been suspected but never charged. In the early 2000s, this testing revealed new potential leads. Trace amounts of DNA were found that didn't match any of the victims, pointing toward the presence of an unknown individual at the crime scene. For many, this breakthrough seemed like the moment the case would finally turn. Investigators identified potential suspects, some of whom had been on their radar for years, but had managed to evade justice due to a lack of solid evidence. Marty Smart, who had long been a person of interest, was once again thrust into the spotlight, as was his friend Bo Baubed. Other individuals with shady pasts or connections to the Keddie area were also re examined under this new forensic lens. The new DNA findings injected fresh life into the case, sparking media coverage and renewed public interest. For the Sharp family and the community of Keddie, it felt like long awaited justice might be within reach. But despite the advances, the results were frustratingly inconclusive. While the DNA evidence pointed to the presence of unknown individuals, it didn't provide enough clarity to directly link any one person to the murders. The genetic material could have belonged to anyone: a visitor, a friend, or even someone who had innocently been in the cabin before the murders. It was a tantalizing but incomplete piece of the puzzle. In many ways, the DNA advancements offered more questions than answers. Who did the genetic material belong to, and why were they at the scene? Was this person the killer, or were they somehow involved in another way? Investigators were left with these troubling uncertainties despite the promising lead. The case once again stalled. The frustrating reality of cold cases is that even with modern technology, evidence degrades over time, and the mishandling of the crime scene in the 80s left key clues irretrievable. The potential suspects identified by the new DNA findings couldn't be conclusively tied to the crime, and without a solid match, there was no path forward for prosecution. For the Sharp family and the community of Keddie, this was another heartbreaking blow. The DNA advancements, while groundbreaking, were simply not enough to bring the killers to justice. The case remains unsolved, with these new leads offering a faint but incomplete glimpse into the events of that night. It served as a painful reminder that even with the best technology, some crimes can slip through the cracks of time, and some killers may never be held accountable for the horrors they inflicted. The renewed attention from DNA testing kept the Keddie murders in the public eye, but it also underscored how delicate the pursuit of justice can be. As science pushes the boundaries of what's possible, there's still an enduring frustration when the answers remain just out of reach. The case of Cabin 28, even with the advancements of forensic technology, remains an unsolved tragedy. Marty Smart and his friend Bo Baubed remain two of the most intriguing figures in the Keddie Cabin murders. Marty, with his troubled marriage to Marilyn and his known hostility towards Sue Sharp, was always a central suspect. Bo, a man with a dark past and ties to organized crime, was staying with Marty at the time of the murders. Their connection to the crime seemed more than coincidental, and when you revisit their stories, the cracks are impossible to ignore. The night of the murders, Marty and Bo claimed to have been at a local bar before returning home. However, their accounts of the evening were riddled with inconsistencies. Witnesses couldn't confirm their exact whereabouts during the critical hours when the murders occurred. Marty later allegedly confessed to his counselor about the killings, but the confession was never acted upon. Bo's criminal history only added to the suspicion, suggesting that these weren't random killings, but perhaps orchestrated by someone with experience in violent crime. Bo's background in organized crime raised red flags. He wasn't just an ordinary visitor, his connections suggested he could have been involved in something far more calculated. While Marty's possible motive was personal, Bo's involvement hinted at the murders being more than just a crime of passion. The lack of forced entry, the level of violence, and the removal of Tina Sharp's body all suggested a crime that required planning. Despite these glaring inconsistencies and suspicions, neither Marty nor Bo was ever charged. Their conflicting alibis, Marty's alleged confession, and Bo's shady past left law enforcement with a tangled web that was never fully unraveled. The possibility that this wasn't a random act, but something more deliberate, lingers to this day, leaving many wondering whether justice slipped through their fingers when Marty and Bo walked away. One of the more unsettling theories that surfaced in the years following the Keddie murders involves the possibility of a connection to drug activity in the area. Some investigators began to suspect that the crime was far more organized than initially thought, possibly linked to a local drug ring. This theory suggested that the murders were not just a personal vendetta, but part of a larger, calculated effort to silence Sue Sharp or someone in her circle. The town of Keddie, though small and quiet, wasn't immune to the darker undercurrents of drug trafficking that swept through rural areas during that time. There were whispers that Sue Sharp may have unwittingly crossed paths with people involved in illegal drug operations. Whether she had witnessed something she shouldn't have or had unknowingly become a threat to individuals involved in criminal activity, some believed that Sue was targeted because of what she knew, not who she was. The brutality of the murders, combined with the methodical removal of Tina's body, seemed too extreme to be purely personal. The level of violence, the use of multiple weapons, and the apparent staging of the scene all suggested a degree of organization that could point to something beyond a crime of passion. Investigators began to consider the possibility that Sue and perhaps her family were collateral damage in a broader scheme. This theory gained traction as the randomness of the murders seemed increasingly unlikely. If Sue had indeed witnessed something related to local drug operations, something dangerous enough to prompt a cover up, it would explain the ferocity of the attack and the lengths to which the killers went to silence her. While there's no concrete evidence to support this theory, the organized nature of the crime raised disturbing questions about who might have been involved and whether the killings were a form of retribution or intimidation. The theory involving drug cartels remains speculative but offers a chilling alternative explanation. It posits that the murders were not just a senseless act of rage, but a calculated move to eliminate a perceived threat, casting the tragedy in an even darker light. Whether Sue was knowingly involved or just an innocent witness remains unclear, but the possibility of a larger criminal conspiracy adds a new layer of complexity to an already haunting mystery. As investigators tried to untangle the web surrounding the Keddie murders, conflicting testimonies from key individuals only added to the confusion. One of the most complicated aspects of the case was the shifting and contradictory accounts from people closely connected to the victims, especially Marilyn Smart, Marty Smart's wife, and Sue Sharp's neighbor. Her statements, along with those from other witnesses, raised serious doubts about the reliability of the information being gathered and contributed to the case becoming a tangled mess. Marilyn Smart initially stood by her husband, claiming she knew nothing of Marty's involvement in the murders. However, over time, her story began to change. Later, Marilyn admitted that Marty had behaved suspiciously on the night of the murders, even hinting that he might have been involved. Her eventual separation from Marty fueled speculation that she knew more than she was letting on, but the shifting nature of her statements made it difficult to pin down the truth. Was Marilyn genuinely unaware of what had happened that night, or was she trying to protect herself or Marty? The inconsistency of her testimony only deepened the mystery. Other witnesses, including neighbors and people from the local bar, also provided conflicting accounts of what they saw or heard on the night of the murders. Some recalled seeing Marty and Bo at the bar during the critical hours, while others questioned their whereabouts entirely. The discrepancies between these testimonies made it hard for investigators to construct a reliable timeline. Adding to the confusion, some witnesses later recanted parts of their stories, leaving law enforcement to sift through unreliable and inconsistent information. These conflicting accounts weren't just frustrating, they were damaging to the case. Every time a new detail emerged or someone changed their story, it muddied the waters further. Investigators were left questioning the credibility of key witnesses, particularly when the stories seemed to shift based on who was being questioned. The fact that people close to the case couldn't seem to provide clear or consistent statements created an atmosphere of doubt and uncertainty, preventing law enforcement from making definitive progress. This lack of clarity also raised deeper questions. Were these conflicting testimonies the result of genuine confusion and fear, or was there something more sinister at play? Some have speculated that certain individuals were deliberately misleading investigators, either out of fear of retaliation or to cover up their own involvement. Marilyn, in particular, remains a figure of interest. Her gradual shift from defending Marty to casting suspicion on him left many wondering whether she knew far more than she ever revealed. Ultimately, the conflicting testimonies contributed to the complexity of solving the Keddie murders. The more the stories changed, the harder it became for investigators to pursue solid leads. The confusion, combined with law enforcement's early missteps, made it feel as though the truth was slipping further away with each contradictory statement. Whether these conflicting testimonies were the result of fear, manipulation, or simple human error, they remain one of the central reasons why the Keddie case remains unsolved to this day. One of the most significant and unsettling aspects of the Keddie murders was the use of multiple weapons to carry out the killings. Investigators discovered that a hammer, a knife, and a bent steak knife had all been used in the brutal assault on the victims. The presence of these weapons was more than just a grisly detail. It suggested a deeper, more coordinated plan behind the crime and raised serious questions about the number of perpetrators involved. The fact that different weapons were used points to a level of premeditation and coordination that goes beyond a spontaneous act of violence. If this had been a crime of opportunity or an impulsive outburst, it's unlikely that the killers would have employed multiple tools in such a methodical manner. The use of a hammer to bludgeon and the deliberate stabbing of the victims with two separate knives indicated a clear intent to inflict as much damage as possible. It wasn't just a quick, frenzied attack, it was prolonged and calculated. This brings us to the possibility of multiple perpetrators. It's difficult to imagine that one person alone could have controlled and overpowered four victims, including two teenage boys who might have tried to fight back. The presence of multiple weapons suggests that there may have been at least two people involved, each wielding a different weapon, coordinating their efforts to carry out the murders. This theory is further supported by the sheer level of brutality involved. It's as if the killers took turns inflicting harm, ensuring that no one in the cabin would survive. The organized use of weapons also challenges the idea that this was a random or impulsive act. The attackers came prepared, knowing they would need different tools to accomplish their gruesome task. They didn't simply grab what was lying around the cabin, they brought these weapons with them or selected them deliberately from the surroundings, indicating that this was not an unplanned encounter. The precision and forethought behind the use of multiple weapons suggest a crime that was orchestrated long before that fatal night. Furthermore, the attackers didn't just kill their victims, they staged the scene in a way that implied control and purpose. Chairs were knocked over and items were scattered around, almost as if to create the appearance of chaos, when in reality the crime was anything but chaotic. The killers seemed to know exactly what they were doing, from binding the victims with electrical cords to using different weapons for maximum effect. This level of organization points to individuals who were not only capable of extreme violence, but who had the presence of mind to manipulate the scene afterward. Analyzing the multiple weapons used in the Keddie murders reinforces the idea that this was no crime of passion. It was planned, coordinated, and executed with terrifying precision. The presence of multiple perpetrators, the use of different weapons, and the deliberate nature of the crime all point to a level of premeditation that goes far beyond a spur of the moment attack. The killers came prepared, and the use of multiple weapons reveals just how calculated their actions were that night. Decades after the Keddie Cabin murders, the victims' families and the public continued to push for answers. The unresolved nature of the case became a haunting reminder of how justice can slip through the cracks, and this persistent pressure led to renewed efforts by law enforcement. The families of Sue, John, Tina, and Dana, as well as the Keddie community, refused to let the case fade into obscurity. They demanded that law enforcement revisit the crime and take advantage of modern forensic techniques. The frustration of having more questions than answers, even after years of investigation, weighed heavily on everyone involved. With new DNA testing, re examination of evidence, and media coverage bringing the case back into the spotlight, hopes were raised that the truth might finally emerge. Yet, despite these efforts, no definitive conclusion was reached. The renewed investigations fueled by public pressure revealed promising leads, but they ultimately fell short of delivering the closure that the victims' families so desperately sought. The public's role in keeping the case alive cannot be understated. Without their voices and constant calls for justice, it's possible the Keddie murders would have faded into the annals of unsolved crimes. But as the years passed and the leads dwindled, the frustration grew. How could such a violent and complex crime remain unsolved for so long? The longer the case lingered in the shadows, the deeper the mystery grew, and with each passing year, the sense that justice was slipping away became harder to ignore. From a criminal profiling perspective, the Keddie murders reflect a chilling combination of revenge, rage, and cold calculation. The level of violence inflicted on the victims, particularly Sue Sharp, suggests a deeply personal motive. The attackers weren't just intent on killing, they were intent on sending a message. This leads many to believe that the crime was fueled by intense anger or a vendetta likely directed towards Sue herself. One theory posits that this was an act of revenge, possibly tied to Sue's involvement with Marty Smart's wife, Marilyn. If Sue had been encouraging Marilyn to leave Marty, it's conceivable that Marty's anger festered, eventually exploding into this horrific crime. The brutality, especially the way Sue was bound and gagged, points to a perpetrator who felt the need to dominate and control their victim, a hallmark of someone with personal, emotional ties to the victim. However, there's a more sinister layer to the crime that extends beyond simple rage. The use of multiple weapons, the staging of the scene, and the removal of Tina Sharp all suggest a degree of planning and manipulation. This wasn't a crime born purely out of impulsive rage, there was forethought involved. The psychological profile of the attackers could indicate a mix of sadistic tendencies and a desire for power, with Sue perhaps being seen as a threat to someone's control, whether in a domestic or criminal context. The psychological profile also leaves room for a darker, more sinister motive, one that may involve elements of criminal enterprise or organized crime. Given the speculation about drug activity in the area, it's possible that Sue or her family unwittingly became targets because of something they knew or witnessed, making the murders an act of silencing witnesses rather than pure personal revenge. The Keddie Cabin Murders remain one of the most haunting unsolved cases in American history. After more than 40 years, the brutal slayings of Sue Sharp, John Sharp, Dana Wingate, and Tina Sharp continue to weigh heavily on the community and the victims' families. The questions remain: how could such a violent crime go unsolved for so long? Was this a personal act of revenge, or was there a deeper conspiracy at play? As new forensic techniques emerge and cold cases across the country are reopened, there's always a flicker of hope that the Keddie case might finally be solved. But with each passing year, the chances seem to slip further away. Will there ever be a breakthrough, or is the truth buried forever in the isolated mountains of Northern California? The legacy of the Keddie murders isn't just in the unanswered questions, it's in the lasting impact the crime has had on the victims' families and the small, close knit community of Keddie. The tragedy serves as a grim reminder of the fragility of justice and the toll that unsolved mysteries can take on those left behind. If you or anyone you know has any information related to this case, now is the time to come forward. Even the smallest detail could be the missing piece that finally brings justice to the Sharp and Wingate families. Sometimes it only takes one new lead to break open a case that has been closed for far too long. The victims deserve answers and their families deserve closure. Together, we can keep the pressure on and ensure that the Keddie Cabin murders are never forgotten.